we're going to do this at quite a high level of abstraction, because what's at stake is how you see the kind of entirety of human history, and we really don't have the time to wander through that in detail. So it's a bit like, if you want to see the shape of the world, the best view is from outer space. We're going to be quite high up in terms of how we look at these things in terms of ideas. So let me start with the thing that Marx and Engels thought was at the absolutely fundamental level at which you could look at human history. And they tried to extract from the whole kind of panoply of historical development the most basic, fundamental, and elementary building block on which it was possible to think about the way in which societies had developed. And what they came up with was this thought, that it was, and I quote Engels here, the production and reproduction of real life, which is the most elementary building block of human history. That is, that in order to survive, human beings must find food, they must find shelter, they must find warmth, they must find clothing, the most elementary things which guarantee the survival of human life, the production and reproduction of real life. That was the most fundamental thing in Marx and Engels' view. And for people who didn't really believe that there were very many absolutely fixed and stable things, that there were very few unchanging things across the course of human history, on another occasion, they put it like this. They said that it is the struggle with nature, that is the struggle to extract from the natural world those things that human beings need in order to survive, which was the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence. Now, as I say, these were people who didn't really believe that there was such a thing as a kind of everlasting human nature, that people were naturally good or naturally bad or naturally ambitious or naturally sought profit or any of those conventional ideas about the supposed fixity of human nature. But they did believe that this was fixed, that human beings had to extract from the natural world the conditions of their existence. And that actually made them, of course, some of the earliest ecologists. They realized that there was a fundamental and unbreakable bond between human beings and the natural world that they were a part of. Their very bodies, of course, were a natural fact, an animal fact. And so that bond with nature, the requirement to gather from nature the means for existence, was the fundamental building block of human history. But they also thought that there was something quite specific and particular about the way in which human beings did this, as opposed to anything else, any other animal on the planet. And in Capital, Marx puts it this way. He says, what is it that differentiates the worst human architect from the best of bees? Bees create geometrically perfect structures. Honeycombs are geometrically perfect structures. What is it, he said, that distinguishes the best of bees from the worst of human architects? And he said the difference is this, that human beings erect in their mind's eye, the thing that they're going to build first, whereas bees and other animals construct things, but they construct it from instinct, from something that's evolutionary programmed for them to do. Whereas human beings exercise a degree of precognition, of preparation, of mental imagining, that they have in their mind's eye something that they're going to create before they actually go about creating it. And therefore human labor, the way in which humans extract what they need from the natural world around them, was a conscious and deliberative process, not simply an instinctual process. Moreover, it's always a social process. there are never Robinson Crusoes. Well, even Robinson Crusoe, of course, had Man Friday, and there's a story that we won't have time to get into just at the moment. But there's no isolated human being that's ever been capable of doing this for very long. It's always, and in human history, fundamentally a social process. So here we've got three critical statements. One, human beings have to get what they need from the natural world around them. This is the precondition of all social development, of all historical change. This is what human beings are doing. Two, they're doing it consciously. Three, they're doing it collectively. And so this, taken together, was the sort of fundamental building blocks of Marx and Engels' view of history. They put it very strongly at one point. They said, world history is simply the production of man through human labor. So the production of human beings by the use of conscious human labor. And this shapes all social production, all social development, all historical change. But of course, this is a very, 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 very abstract set of propositions altogether, and left at this level of abstraction wouldn't tell us very much about the actual progress of change or possibilities of change in human history. And of course, Marx and Engels wanted to have a theory which was much more workable, much more usable than that, much more capable of generating historical explanation. And so in terms of making this a more specific thing, they looked at what happens when human beings do combine collectively and do produce the things that they need from the world around them. Initially, they said in the most primitive societies, they could only produce enough to survive, if not day by day, then at least week by week, month by month, perhaps at most year by year. That there was no surplus produced, nothing that could be hoarded, traded, or accumulated. That what human beings produced was nearly all immediately consumed. And that fact, the kind of backwardness, if you like, or the low level of productivity, produced a kind of rough equality, what Marx and Engels called primitive communism. That when there was no in development, productive, technological development, which could produce a surplus in the society, when nearly everything had to be consumed immediately, there was a rough equality in the society. Once human beings began to develop in ways and to develop the means of producing more than was immediately consumed, then the possibility of at least some of those people in that society accumulating it, hoarding it, trading it, became a possibility, and also coincided with the development of the family, of a state machine. It's all described in Engels' The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State. And if you think about the title of that book, it's a very, very impressive summary of three absolutely huge developments which take place in human society all at the same time. The establishment of a stable family structure, the what Engels called the world historic defeat of the female sex, in other words, the subordination of women inside a domestic arrangement, the establishment of private property, of privately owned property rather than communal goods, and therefore the ability to accumulate private property, and a state machine, a body of a minority of society ruling over, ultimately by the use of force, the rest of the society. And this is one absolutely huge and historic shift from the so-called primitive communist societies through to the establishment of a state and various forms of class society. Now, across the millennia, of course, the type of society that is, from those first emerging state structures, we've seen ancient slavery, we've seen feudal society, we've seen modern capitalism. There have been enormous changes in the way in which a minority that's able to accumulate, as time goes on, inherit wealth, often land for a huge part of human history, that's changed dramatically. The form and capabilities of the state machine have changed and transformed enormously. And the question for Marx and Engels was, how is it that those transformations take place? What is happening when we move from the ancient slave societies of Greece and Rome to the feudal societies of medieval Europe to modern capitalist societies that have grown up since the 17th century? How is it and why is it that those transformations, those revolutions in human social organization take place? And their answer was this. It was, in a way, to go back to the beginning. It was, in a way, to go back to the first points that I've elaborated in this talk, to look at the ways in which human beings are interacting with the natural world, at the means that they have at their disposal, at the technology, at the level of manufacturing at a later stage that they have, and to look at the ways in which changes in those things could transform the whole of social relations, of class relations, of the way in which the state works, of the way in which ideologies, religion, political thought changes in response to that. Marx, in a very famous but often abused quotation, said that the hand mill gives you society with a feudal lord, whereas the steam mill gives you society dominated by a capitalist. In other words, it was the tools and the capacity to transform the natural world, how great that capacity was, how it was organized, what classes dominated it and what classes did the work in those societies, which marked the different epochs of human development. And they said something else as well, which is that it tends to be the way in which people work, the tools that they have in their disposal, which change first, which change the way in which the economy is being organized, and which then reflect themselves in political change, in ideologies. And so they followed very closely the way in which inventions, whether it be gunpowder or the compass or the spinning jenny, would interact with the people that developed them, change the way in which they worked, change the relationships in the economy, and ultimately the relationships in the state as well. So just let me give you a flavor of Marx and Engels' own words on this question. This is from a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, where they say, in the social production of their existence, men enter into definite necessary relationships which are independent of their will, namely relations of production corresponding to a determinate stage of development of their material forces of production. In other words, you're born into a society, and if when you're born into that society, the dominant form of production is small artisanal production and peasant labor on the land, that confronts you as an unalterable circumstance. That's just how things are, and you fit into it. And if over time those production relations begin to change, then the whole society, the class relations, the ideological relations, the political relations also change with it. So as they say, the totality of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which there arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which there correspond definite forms of social consciousness. Now, this doesn't mean to say, of course, that individuals, can't imagine something different. In practically every class society, there's been individuals, groups of the oppressed, different ideological spokesmen who've imagined a different society. The question is, can it be reached with the means, material means available? In some ways, it's been the same thing with inventions. If you look at Leonardo da Vinci's Paris manuscripts, you can see that he invented an idea for a helicopter. This is in the year of 1480. There it is, a drawing of a helicopter. He'd imagined something which was centuries in advance of its time, but he couldn't make one that would fly. He couldn't make one that would fly because they didn't have material strong enough or a motor power powerful enough to drive the corkscrew mechanism which he drew, as a matter of fact, of a helicopter. So he could imagine a helicopter in 1480. It couldn't be built until the 20th century. So it's not that people can't think different thoughts, it's that their ability to transform society, to become a social reality on a widely dispersed scale, depends on the material means available to people. So Marx and Engels summarized this by saying it's not the consciousness of men that determines their being. In other words, it's not Leonardo's ability to think of a helicopter which could transform medieval Italian society. No, that was limited by the material means around them. But he says that at a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of a society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, and then an era of revolution begins. In other words, building up within the old society, because the interaction with nature gives you a permanent dynamic, a permanent process of change, there are ways of producing, ways of organizing production, which begin to outlive, begin to burst through the old political superstructure, the old set of ideas which had grown up around them. And that's why, in another kind of very powerful metaphor, Marx says, think about the myth of the messenger of the gods in ancient Greek and Roman society, Mercury, the messenger of the gods. Or think about the ancient Greek hero Achilles, who could be killed only by being hit in his heel, the only vulnerable spot on his body. He said those could be, in ancient Greek or ancient Roman societies, those could be stories that people really believed were true, but they can't be in modern society. He said, what is Mercury, the messenger of the gods, once you've seen the electric telegraph? Or what is Achilles once you've seen grape shot, shot for a modern cannon? They attain a force that can still grab people's imagination as fairy stories, as myths, but they can't be believed as fact when the material productive forces, the means of warfare, the means of communication, have developed as they have done in modern capitalist society. So those are some of the ways in which Marx and Engels thought about the process of historical change. I want now to deal with one overwhelmingly common objection to them, which is that these are so-called technologically determinist theories, that they say that you could only think according to the level of production. You can only act according to the level of production, that the only kind of ways in which what Marx and Engels called the political superstructure of society can develop are tied in an economically reductionist way, in a technologically determinist way, to the level of production. And I guess there's a couple of things to be said about that. First of all, there is obviously, and Marx and Engels intend there to be, a strong relationship between the way in which human beings organize, the classes that arise on the basis of historical production, and the way in which people organize politically, think ideologically, think in religious or political terms about the society. And I've given some examples to show both that is a strong and important relationship, but also that it's not an absolutely determinist one. It isn't that Leonardo da Vinci couldn't think of a helicopter. That was way beyond the technological production abilities of the time, but that's why he couldn't build one. So it's a complex relationship. And it's also an interactive relationship. When Marx and Engels say at a certain point in time, the relations of production come into conflict with the way in which the society is developing as a whole, what they're saying is that a possibility of change is arising here. Not kind of a sort of blank sheet of paper that you can paint anything on it, but the society has come to a turning point where certain possibilities have arisen, and possibly they can be acted upon and realized, or not, or those possibilities won't be acted on, and society will take a very different path. So, for instance, they looked at certain societies, certain Eastern societies, which they described as Oriental despotisms, where it had reached the same kind of crisis that feudal society in Western Europe reached, but because of the weight of the state machine within those societies, there wasn't a revolutionary transformation which opened up the possibility of modern capitalism as there was in England, then America and France, as a result of the English Revolution in the 17th century and the French and American revolutions a century later. So there wasn't just one outcome of a social crisis. A social crisis could be predicted on the basis of production having developed beyond the limits of the old society, but that didn't mean to say, in a technologically determinist way, that there was the inevitability of progress. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels said that the crises in capitalist society could result in socialism, or could result, in their phrase, in the common ruin of the contending classes. In other words, in a kind of destructive spiral where the society was unable to overcome its internal contradictions, unable to develop into a new and different pattern of development. Rosa Luxemburg, of course, had the same thought when she said that the outcome of social struggles was either socialism or barbarism, either the possibility of progress or regression, because the society couldn't overcome the contradictions between the enormous wealth that it generated and the private ownership of that wealth by the capitalist class and its state. Lenin similarly, when he said that the capitalists can always solve their crisis. Now, that's a strange thought coming from Lenin, isn't it? You know, Lenin associated with the idea that the capitalists can't solve their crisis. But Lenin said the capitalists can always solve their crisis so long as the working class are willing to pay the price. In other words, it's the same thought as the common ruin of the contending classes, that society can fail to progress, can be driven into a spiral of constant crisis and decline, unless we act in ways which ensure one outcome, a revolutionary outcome, rather than the common ruin of the contending classes. So, and Marx and Engels thought that this had happened in the past, that this was how the society had, bourgeois society, capitalist society, had developed in the first place. That in England in the 1640s, the absolute monarchy of Charles I was incapable of developing the society through the kind of market that the merchants and the City of London and some of the gentry in the countryside wanted to happen, and that the crisis of Charles I's regime, the English Revolution and the Civil War decided matters in a way which allowed England to become the first modern industrial capitalist society. It could have been otherwise. And that really brings us back to the original concept that Marx and Engels had of human labor. If you remember, their idea at the very beginning was of conscious human labor, of the ability to see in your mind's eye something before you create it in reality. Well, really, all political activity is a version of human labor. All our collective enterprises to change the society are a development of that model, of seeing the possibility of building something in our mind's eye and then acting in ways which make it happen. And that's why, as well as seeing the social structure and the ability to manufacture or to produce things from nature as being a limiting, a conditional framework within which we act, that was true. It wasn't true that it predetermined the outcomes, all the outcomes of what we might do. So Marx in another place says, history fights no wars, builds no machines. It is real living men who do all this. And in perhaps the most famous statement of this idea, he said, men make their own history, but not in conditions of their own choosing, but in given and transmitted conditions from the past. In other words, we do have the freedom to shape the society around us, but the precondition of being able to do so is to understand what the framework, what the limits and possibilities, where the power lies and where it may not lie, where the weaknesses of our opponents lie and where their strengths lie. It's the ability to see the objective structure shaping us, which gives us the possibility to see where the points of change and transformation, the points of leverage are within that society. And of course, Marx and Engels, by the time they came to look at capitalist society, were very clear about where that power lay. It lay in the power of the producers, in the power of the people who did the work to produce the capitalist profit. It was their collective ability to imagine, plan, and act on the possibilities which their place in this society gave them. That wasn't their choice. They didn't choose to be like this, but having found themselves in this place, they could understand from their point of view what power it gave them and formulate political strategies for using that power to transform society, to save the society from barbarism, and to open up the possibility of sharing wealth equally. And for Marx and Engels, capitalist society had bequeathed us one huge benefit. It had developed the means of production to the point where it was possible for everyone to live in plenty. At the very beginning, there had been primitive communism in which everybody was equal in poverty. But capitalism had given us a society which produced so much that there was a possibility not just of a minority, not a minority of ancient slaveholders or a minority of feudal lords or a minority of capitalists living in plenty, but of the whole society sharing the wealth. And that was what gave the possibility of communism, of a society, of a socialist society of equality, being the possible outcome of the struggle of the working class in a way that it had never been possible as an outcome of feudal peasants or medieval merchants. So I'll leave it there.